America. My name is Osei-Frimpong. I come to you live every Monday and Thursday. Monday, I try to do more of a relationship show. On Thursday, I do more of a hard politics show. Today's going to meet in the middle as I poop on womanhood. And a lot of women are going to get caught up in the flack, but there's collateral damage in some of these wars. So I'm going to poop on womanhood because as the father of two daughters, I understand. It's funny, I've become more of a cultural misogynist as I raise my daughters. The worst influences on my daughters are other women. And my daughters would be both better women and better people if there were fewer women in life. So I had to be very kind of vicious in curating the women they're around and the women that I give authority to around. Because it's okay if they're around strange bad women because they know not to actually trust what strangers say. But if they are around women that I've like somehow sanctioned for them to listen to, I need to be very careful about who those women are around my kids. I have to be less careful with women around guys because at least with guys and my daughters, guys know, and it's kind of like in their mean and culture that to be anything, you have to do stuff. The problem with crappy women is that they'll teach my daughters that they can be something without actually doing anything. And that, I think, is a problem, right? And so where does this come from? And you're saying, oh, man, that's an awful thing to say. You can't trash women like that, except, let's be honest, we have an accountability problem with women in these United States, and that ends up being a political problem because not only are they the ones who told us that it's cool to go into the Ukraine, and they're the ones, because Zelensky's, Putin's bad, and Zelensky's bad, and they're the ones who were cool with supporting Israel, or cool with, or they're the ones who are cool with closing schools. If women didn't want to go into, if U.S. women didn't want to go to Ukraine, if U.S. women didn't want to just ship guns to Israel willy-nilly, if U.S. women didn't want to close schools for the pandemic, none of those things would have happened. And they were wrong about all of those things. Wrong about all of those things. And this is the NPR, especially the NPR class of women, because they kind of set the gender identity for the rest. On the liberal side. On the conservative side, it's different. I actually have more respect for conservative women because they know that their version of womanhood buys them a sense of unaccountability, so that they just see decisions to the area of men, and it's a little bit more honest than liberal women who still want to feel entitled to unaccountability, but also want the power to just be irresponsible with it without being accountable to it. That is the life we live. I just don't want that version of gender identity imputed on my daughter. So I have to be very, very careful about which women are around my daughters, especially which women that my daughters actually listen to are around my daughters. Because American womanhood's not great. It's not great. And if you don't like American politics, well, you know what? Like, women outvote men in every age range, in every demographic. And you know what? They do not have great politics, especially the white ones. So there's actually an issue, but there's an interesting story I'm going to tell you about why women in the United States are unaccountable and why we think there's some sort of universal womanhood that transcends class and nationality, as if like poor, like middle class women in a suburban United States have the same sort of anxiety as like a Dalit women in India. Dalit's the lowest caste of women in India. When honestly, upper middle class white women in the United States don't even have the same sensibility about gender and their world as their maids or nannies or preschool providers, right? So it's not. There is no universal womanhood. In the same way, there's no real universal manhood. The problem is that the class of women who pay everybody else's salary pay other people, including poor women and black women, to pretend that there's a sisterhood when there's nothing in common between these women, except for maybe class aspiration that gets moved in through gender. So a lot of these awful things get moved in through gender. Gender is like the proxy or the Trojan horse through which a lot of class and race politics. My audio is choppy. My audio is choppy? All right. How choppy is choppy? Is it so choppy I should just start this again? Give me something in the chats. And I'll let you know. Audio's fine. All right, so my audio's fine. I'm just going to keep talking. So let me tell you the historical reason why this is the case. Right, so the gender relations we have in the United States are an outgrowth of colonialism, are an outgrowth of our racial projects. The relationship between white men and white women has everything to do with how to police non-white people. First, Native Americans. There was a way in which, FD Signifier has some growing to do. There was a way in which things were easier before we legitimized black men being full people, right? Because then they didn't need victims in the same way. They, meaning, the white supremacist order, didn't need victims in the same way to legitimize then policing and disciplining and pretty much rendering disposable black men, right? So when black men were 3/5 of people, it was a little bit easier. The gender relationships between white women and black men, white women and white men were different than what they were when black men had to be legally recognized. Because when black men became legally recognized, that means you needed an entire ideological system to degrade them, right? And the entire ideological system included them being sexual threats and perpetrators of violence. And if you need black men being perpetrators, you need a victim. And you need a victim to protect. And so now white men have plausible deniability because they're protecting somebody else. And white women have plausible deniability because they are eternal victims, right? So if white women are always vulnerable, they can't also be held accountable as actors because other people must always take care of them. And now we have a reason to always police the safety of white women. Now, what do we have to do? We have to make sure white women get out of their household and in society, because now we have a reason to police society. You get this pretty clear if you read, early both anti-suffragettes and suffragettes like Dodge and especially Charlotte Gilman, who's actually pretty smart, huge racist, but she's pretty smart. So you need white women in society then to police society, and so you need an internal victim. And that victim mentality or that victim entitlement, because there are perks. There are perks to being, especially a white woman. But when people aspire to be women, they're aspiring into that life of unaccountability, yet power. Unaccountability and power. Let's stop pretending that we expect women to be accountable in the same way we expect men to be accountable in this society. Men can be disposable. If you don't produce, if you don't earn, you don't eat. like we don't expect that same thing from women. We don't expect them to earn in the same way. We don't expect them to be in the same way. We don't expect them to be accountable. We don't even expect them to drive. We don't be accountable for getting point A to point B. We do not expect, and that's not the worst place for them to be, because they can be wrong about everything. Especially, like I said, that class of NPR class of white women who said, "Let's back Ukraine. Let's close schools. Let's close the world because of the health, and let's back Ukraine because Putin's bad, but let's also back Israel because as bad as Bibi is, we have to support Israel's right to exist, even though they prosecuted genocide." If white women were ever to lead a revolution, you know that revolution's not going anywhere. Anytime I walk into a meeting and it's just shot through with white women, I just I'm tempted to just turn around and walk back out because I know nothing real is going to get done because they're too invested in the system. So don't women earn that non-expectation through sex? Well, I don't know. They aspire to earn that non-expectation, but like that's a personal relationship. That's not politically accountable. Like that's not publicly accountable. The problem is going to be holding women publicly accountable. And honestly, as we've opened up, and I'm one of these people who actually I have daughters who I treat as like competent and accountable, and they also realize that their tears don't their tears don't work on me, and like in the same way that like I guess they've taught they should. And it's also one of the reasons why my daughters are awesome, because I treat them like sons. And I'm around, and I'm very, I police the women I allow to be around my daughters, because a lot of garbage gets transmitted through gender, and that's very. I don't want my daughters to be full of garbage, right? So we have a hard time holding that variety of womanhood publicly accountable because of the racial history of the United States and colonial in general, but especially the racial history of the United States, insofar as we needed eternal victims in order to support a regime of policing the racialized other, whether it was Native American or whether it was black people. It's also a reason why immigrants, families come to the United States, especially if they didn't have, depending on their relationship with colonialism, they can come to the United States, and the women aren't as, like the mothers are just better. White women are the worst mothers in the United States, especially liberal white women are the worst parents in the United States, because they think that children are raised by nature. Like they actually don't believe in parenting, because they're selfish, right? So and people are gonna say like, well, isn't your wife white army? Isn't your wife white? Yeah, we talked about it, and she'll agree about the entitlements that her set. And the good news is, what's hilarious is all of her set's kids are like awful, and all I can say is I told you so. So we're watching that group raise awful kids because they don't actually believe in parenting, and it turns out once again this is how the conservatives do it better with respect to this little thing, because they're at least honest about what you need to actually like parent, and you need to actually be responsible, and liberalism doesn't work like in terms of like raising actually decent people. You need to mix love and discipline together in a responsible way and not in a self-serving way. But that's not something that like we actually teach, the NPR class of white women. So it turns out they're awful parents. They don't find out for 30 years until their kids end up like wastrels. But and they have to like then use all of the money they've accrued to pay for the therapy or the rehabs and all of the other ways that the whites cover for their awful parenting. But it's one reason why recent immigrants, especially who come here with intact families and not a history of colonialism, the women are culturally different. The women are culturally different, so they're better parents. So we have a gender story in the United States that is tied to the racial story, because the gender story within America needed to legitimize the degradation of racialized others. So you needed an unaccountable victim who needed to be protected, and the protection includes like, sicking their man on the rat, or the thing that goes bump in the night, or the area Negro, whatever, like white women sick their guys on. And if you know some cops, the cops know that white women sick cops on people that they just don't really feel like dealing with. And having been sicked upon, and then in one hilarious instance, being sicked on somebody else, I'm not one of these guys who you're not going to sick me on another guy like that. I've seen seen black guys actually like get bad things happen to them because like they were sicked on like a dog to go attack someone else. So, white women use institutions to sick people on people because that's how they were raised. That's how they were raised, and that's the version of womanhood that was normalized in them. And that's the version of womanhood that was normalized in them. And it's, in a way, it's not their fault, but it's a cultural product that has a racial story behind it. Right? It's not an accident that the ideal of womanhood in America comes with both a victimhood and an inability to hold it publicly accountable. But insofar as this is America, and if you, like me, treat women as equals and think they should be because they are, then we need to hold them accountable publicly like equals. That means if you see that like there's one demographic that keeps making these bad public decisions, like saying, well, Hillary Clinton's the most electable person in the Democratic primary, we need to hold that demographic accountable. And the inability to hold women, especially white women, accountable in the United States, I think is screwing up the institutions where they take over. For example, both mental health and especially public education. Like, we can't hold teachers accountable for actually teaching because that would entail holding white women accountable for actually doing their jobs. And we're not, as a society, prepared to do that because that's going to mean tears and all of these things that like we don't want them to have to go through, right? So I'm a big fan of including them in all levels of society and holding them publicly accountable in those levels of society that they need to be held accountable. And I understand why we don't do that. We don't do that because our gender identities emerged and are still sustained by a system of racial control. And the gender identities figure into that. And until you understand that, our understanding of manhood and our understanding of womanhood was directly tied to what needed to happen to legitimize exterminating, both Native Americans and just controlling the black populations, then you understand that why it makes sense that any place in the United States where you have like hard racial tension, you're going to have some weird gender dynamics because the gender is one of the mechanisms that sustains the racial hierarchy, right? And why we have a hard time holding women publicly accountable, even when they do public jobs. But as soon as that job gets tied to a gender identity and the way teaching is tied to white womanhood, we have a whole hard time holding that entire industry accountable. For like, we can't expect teachers to teach now because expecting white women to do their jobs is like not something that we're good at as a society, and holding them accountable and firing them when they don't. Right? Like we're watching. This is now the second generation of bad liberals screw up their kids. It's 1.5 generations. There might be a tipping point where we're just honest about like white liberal mothers being awful parents, and the only way to get through that is to just fight through their tears. But we're not there yet. But they are the United States' worst parents. They're even worse than their conservative counterparts. They're even worse. Just think about the casualness with which they will divorce. So the black situation is a little bit more complicated, especially black American descendants of slaves. This isn't going to be the same with Africans, but black American descendants of slaves. There's been a concerted war on the black family. It's funny because I was listening to this interview of Esther Roll talking about how she had to fight to get James on Good Times. And then James, the black father, ended up quitting because he didn't like he didn't like the way they were showing the black family. Right. And it turns out that Marla Gibbs had to do the same thing on 227. She's like, I'm not doing the show if you're going to paint me as single. I'm going to have a man. I like having a guy. Right. So the black family has been targeted to both ideological and like, I need to do a paper on this. I've been researching and nobody's actually done all of the good work on the Jim Crow stressors of the family. But the black family's been targeted. So, you know, a lot of black parents aren't great because they weren't allowed to be raised by great parents. They weren't allowed to be raised by great parents. They just simply weren't. And so they learned it from the media or their parents themselves were scared. And, I mean, how else can you explain an entire epidemic of people who are casual with just taking away their kid's dad? I am writing a paper right now about how that's child abuse. Like the casualness with which people divorce and take away a kid's entire parent, that's child abuse. And we just need to talk about it. That's child abuse. And So I'll do another show on how that itself, the casualness with which people divorce and then fracture the home is not even functioning child abuse. It is child abuse, and we just need to call it that. And since women initiate most of the divorces, we need to talk about how this is like a pathology of womanhood that's just a culture of child abuse in the United States. 90% among college-educated divorces initiated by women. So, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't have married the guy, or shouldn't have had the kid, but it's child abuse, and we have a culture of child abuse, and it's just a casualized culture of child abuse because we just decided that like a whole parent is disposable, as if you know everything it is. Like, who thinks they know everything they need to know about raising a kid? And I'm a good parent, and I'll say like my kids need their mother too, and I'm a good parent. This cultural identity, first of all, we need to understand gender as a cultural and historical artifact that emerges in different places among different classes in different situations. And in the United States situation, the gender identity we think of as normal or even universal is actually a particular artifact that was fit for the control of a black other and, the extermination of a Native American other. Right? We need to understand that that's the gender identity. And that gender identity needed to both legitimize black people as people because, after the Civil War, we had to be legitimized as people, but also stigmatize them as threats to white women. So we have a version of womanhood that can only be seen as imperiled. And as imperiled, they can't be held publicly accountable, which is why we still, to this day, cannot hold that demographic publicly accountable, especially the liberal ones, publicly accountable for just being wrong about everything. Wrong about everything. Like, how else? Who else gets to be so wrong about so many things, especially like the pandemic and the schools? Like, who gets to be so casually wrong about everything without any cultural blowback about, like, why are you so wrong about everything all the time? Right? And like, if you have a problem with the way America votes, you have to understand that's the voting demographic. They are the biggest voting demographic. We have the politics we have because like, that's the group that votes the most, right? And we need to change womanhood, and it's going to go through changing white women because there are all of these alternative womanhoods, but in America, the money and the power is white. So, like, your idea of manhood isn't something you got that's emancipated from white people, and your idea of womanhood isn't something you got emancipated from white women. It's a class aspiration. Both of those gender identities are kinds of class aspirations. So I say you get rid of Both of them. Now, when I talk about that with manhood, the feminists are like, yeah, patriarchy, manhood's a problem. When I talk about getting rid of womanhood, the feminists are like, whoa, now wait a minute, women are sugar and spice and everything nice. And I'm saying like, no, they are a whole one half of the problem. Women, and it might be a harder problem because it's implicit. It's under the surface. It's concealed. The only person, me and Bill Burr, who's figured it out. That like the most regressive and problematic demographic in the United States that we can't actually talk about are, especially on the liberal side, white women, conservative white women, like they know that they like eating on the trough. Liberal white women will be like pro-justice and then like get their huge inheritance for from their like dad or whatever, or like get put on their white husband's contract. So like now their white husband is a woman-owned company because their wife has 51%. This is how a lot of white women get on. So we need to talk about what it means that we have a gender identity that's both politically powerful and publicly unaccountable, and then socially powerful in all of these different spheres of activity, but still as a gender politically unaccountable. If I can't cuss you out, you shouldn't be held in office. I can't vote for anybody I can't cuss out. So if I can't cuss you out, like you shouldn't sit for office. And so not only are they a problem politically, they're a problem socially and with the jobs, they're even a problem in the home because there are no small number, both white and black people, who have to watch their kids like a train wreck slowly get screwed up by an empowered mom who's still bad at momming. So that breaks my heart. Once again, I dodged many bullets in this vein. My kids are dope. My wife knows the program. Like we do a great thing. But, she also realizes when she looks at her friends that she kind of dodged a bullet because, liberal white moms are bad at kids. And you don't find out until 20 years, and they're 20 years, and you're like, what? I have this great career. We have all this money. Why are my kids not great? Well, it's because there are other things that went into being a parent, that like your selfishness never actually allowed you and the therapist you paid to think for you never allowed you to see. Now I heard about this great scam. I had no idea. There's a person who she's white, divorced her husband, gets child support, remarries, got 3 kids from the first guy, so she gets child support for the 3 kids. She's functional, so she's got a job. Remarries, the other guy's a great guy, raises the kids, and while she gets child support, and then that child support goes directly into a college fund. And so now you have this woman who's gotten 3 kids off this guy, and the white guy, so he earns, kids paid for college, another guy raises those kids, and it just seems like this woman got off like a bandit. She's like, and I was like, this is how the whites move. This is how these white women move in ways that we need to be a little bit more hip to and not be scared of calling them misogynist. I already did a video before about why we can't be scared of being called anti-Semitic, because the practice of Judaism and the political ideology of Zionism, while not necessarily tied, are in this historical moment tied. So if you're going to be serious about being anti-Zionist, you're going to have to understandably be comfortable with being charged with being an anti-Semite. Just be comfortable with it. And also, if we're going to actually bring justice in America and get both racial and labor justice, we're going to have to be comfortable with being called a misogynist. By the way, these are the kind of videos that really cut my earnings. They go into my earnings in ways that are not obvious. So I need you to go to www.funkyacademic.com and kick in $5, $15, or $50 a month, and still and keep me in, keep my kids going to soccer camp, and making sure and contribute to their college fund. And so go to www.funkyacademic.com, and I'll still keep coming out with these videos twice a week. But you need to understand, if you take anything from this video, that our gender identities are historical features. In the United States, that historical features is overdetermined by a racial story, right? The gender identities we have are the identities we have that fit for a colonial narrative. They're what a colonial society needed. Someone said, I'm sorry, I'm not stepfather material. Yeah, I don't know if I am either, I'll be honest, because I'm going to be hard on those kids, and it's not going to be comfortable. Because when you're a stepfather, you're kind of an assistant mother. You're not like, I don't really think that, apparently Angelina Jolie has gotten her kids to talk crap about Brad Pitt as a parent, but I suspect that, the kid's just been got. Anyway, yeah, I don't think I'm stepfather material either, unless like you're gonna put up with me actually being hard on the kid, because you got to mix discipline with love in a way that's not. Because actually, love just looks like discipline, because you're trying to do some reprogramming and fighting against society, so you're not going to be popular, and you just got to deal with it. My kids are winning now, but it was confusing them for a while when they were just working harder than all their other kids and their compatriots. And then I wasn't as a stickler with the women that my kids were around. Now I'm a stickler. I don't let my kids actually deal with too many other white women, or too many other women, really white women, that I don't like approve of, but women in general, because they just smuggle too much uselessness into their gender identity. So as they teach my kids how to be girls, they're also teaching my kids how to be useless, and I don't need that. So I just don't, I don't let them around other women other than their mom, and like ones I've carefully curated to make sure that they will teach my kids to be like active doers of deeds. To be active doers of deeds. No crappy like white liberal women for my kids. The white women my kids deal with can actually do stuff, which isn't an overwhelming majority of them. And I'll say that right now. It is what it is. And once I realized that was a problem, that all this other stuff was coming in through gender identity, and my son's great, because like nobody ever tried to teach him how to be a girl. But all of this other stuff that was coming in and teaching my kids how to be a girl was screwing them up. So I just don't let anybody teach my kids. I just don't let anyone teach my kids how to be a girl. I teach them how to be a good whatever, and they seem to be fine. And now they're thriving, and now they're winning. So a lot of nonsense gets into gender identity. And like I said, I've become more of a cultural misogynist as I, raise my daughters, because I just see the garbage that people are trying to feed them in the name of womanhood. And I don't want them to do that. I actually want them to be able to do things, and not wait for and be held accountable when they don't do things, right? So all of this, all of the big damage of womanhood in the United States right now is a culture of public unaccountability. They might have accountability in the household, but not even complete accountability in the household. But social and political accountability as a demographic, they don't have, right? And so we let them screw up our politics, and we let them screw up our society. And I'm not saying kick them out of political action or social opportunities. I'm saying they need to be held accountable as participants in both politics and society, right? And if we do that, what does political accountability look like? We have teachers who feel comfortable not teaching. They feel comfortable that like they should just have to be nice to kids, not deliver information. Or so in the last 40 years, this was probably easier to say before the Dobbs decision, but for the last 40 years, women have made great advances in society, but racial justice and labor justice, like in terms of assets and real like material power, not great. And you would think that those are coincidences, but I think one's because of the other. The more you empower, especially women, white women of a certain class, the more counter-revolutionary your politics, your racial and labor politics is going to be. We need to stop pretending that we've had all of these great racial and labor movements successfully led by like conventional women or even unconventionally women like BLM. I'm just saying the only assets that moved at a community level were just moved to Patrice Cooler's private account, right? So it is what it is. We need to change both manhood and womanhood. Everybody knows we need to change manhood. Nobody talks about why we need to change womanhood. But we need to change them both. No, I thought teachers were bad because we don't fund schools. No, teachers are bad because they don't know how to fight to be good, right? It's not just the money. Teachers don't want to teach. We close down schools because teachers don't want to teach and are always looking, because teachers went for the job because like it wasn't, because they didn't take the job seriously enough to get sick. Whereas other people, real essential workers that we actually, took seriously had to go to work. It's not just that we don't fund schools. We don't have the quality of teachers who advocate for the funding they need, right? Because right now we give these people more and more money. They still won't teach because they don't know how to teach. They don't care about teaching. They just want to be nice to the kids. They just want to be liked or good with kids, or like they're just it's a fundamentally unserious profession. Honestly, the same with mental health. Apparently when in the early 20th centuries, a lot of therapists just kept blaming mothers. And that, like the 70s kind of beat that out of them. And so now they don't do that anymore. But we've gone the other way. A lot of mothers are bad out there. And the therapists don't blame them because we're not okay with the idea that it could be a woman's fault. So it's not that schools are bad because we don't fund the schools. We don't fund the schools because teachers aren't responsible stewards of children. The teachers we have aren't responsible students and responsible advocates. We're also not honest that women aren't great union organizers. Like if they were, then the feminist movement of the last 40 years would have also been a great time in labor. But instead they have all these excuses about why they shouldn't have to organize. And then so like, I don't know. If you want a revolutionary space and you walk in and it's a bunch of white women wearing pussy hats, I'm just not convinced that like you're going to get the revolution you think, the labor, racial justice, the hard revolution that you think you're going to get. Because they eat on every side of the trough. They eat on every side of the trough, and we need to stop pretending. We need to stop pretending that feminism is going to save us, or that womanhood doesn't come with a bunch of junk. Womanhood doesn't come with a bunch of junk. The worst racial and labor politics come, and like all of these, the worst politics come from like gender identity, that stuff that's embedded within gender identity. It's Trojan horsed in gender identity, especially womanhood. So I don't know, the greatest way to take the piss out of any real movement is to just fill it full of a certain class of white women. Then it's not going to go anywhere. All right, thank you for your time. I will talk to you on Thursday, talking about something slightly different. I hope you kind of get the historical sense of gender identity. And, if you want a few books on this, by far the best book on this is Tommy Curry's The Man Not. Tommy Curry's The Man Not. It's really dense, So it's kind of hard, but you can read Louise Newman's White Women's Rights. You can read, some of the first wave feminists themselves, like Charlotte Gilman. Her book on economics. It's actually not so bad. Women in Economics. Do I have it here? No. What else could you read to get the historical sensibility around womanhood? There's Melissa Stein's book, The Mismeasure of Man. But it's all of these books come down to the same thesis, that the gender identities we're comfortable with and we universalize as all women are really historically particular identities that have emerged to legitimize the degradation of racialized others, right? So now that, say, the racialized other is a legitimate citizen, we need a legitimate reason to police and degrade them. And in order to police and degrade them legitimately, we have to cast them as perpetrators of harm to another class of people who are always victims. And that other class of people who are always victims, white women. So they have a gender identity that's tied to always being vulnerable. And when you're always vulnerable, you can't be publicly accountable for everything you do because you have to be kind of feckless. Because you're always vulnerable to people who actually have effect, right? And so we've empowered these people who we can't hold publicly accountable because they're always vulnerable, because we want to use their vulnerability to police the racialized other. And we're living in a world where we've empowered these women we can't hold publicly accountable for their social or political views. And we're living in a world where people aspire to that womanhood but don't admit to aspiring to that womanhood. Sure, it's not the worst kind of class or gender aspiration to aspire to an identity that can't be held publicly accountable. Yeah. Oh, what does not being held publicly accountable look like? There's a great picture I have. I used to post, you can go to some of my old videos. It was about women in prison and how we do not imprison women. The most carceral nation in the history of the world, it finds it impossible to put women in prison. You need to do cocaine off of if you're a white woman, you need to do cocaine off of a policeman's badge while reaching for his gun in order to be locked up, right? Because that's just not your role in society. Your role in society is to call the police on someone else, right? So thank you for your time. I will see you Thursday. Peace. Oh, if you appreciate what I'm doing, go to www.funkyacademic.com. You should do that. It's very important. Also subscribe and share with your friends and all that stuff. But definitely go to www.funkyacademic.com, kick in $5, $15, or $50 a month, and I'll keep doing what I'm doing. Peace.